I will never forget that carnival. How could I? I still remember the electrifying atmosphere that took over Rio de Janeiro. The street parades, the vibrant costumes, and the pounding rhythms filled the hearts of the revelers. But behind the euphoria, a growing fear lingered, a silent shadow creeping through the alleys, favelas, and avenues. That was the year of the fever of fire, as they called it, a mysterious disease spreading like wildfire throughout the city. It started with a mild fever, but within hours, the person's skin began to burn as if they were being scorched from the inside out. The infected developed red and yellow patches, and their flesh seemed to boil beneath their skin. The end was always tragic. The victims succumbed to convulsions of pain, their screams echoing through the streets like a warning of impending doom. There was no cure, only fear and chaos. It was in this dark setting that I received an unusual invitation. A party, the note said, a masquerade ball in one of Rio de Janeiro's old mansions, high above Santa Teresa. It promised to be an unforgettable night, an escape from the horror that had gripped the city. The host was an eccentric millionaire, known for his fortune, but little else was known about him. Perhaps that was what drew me in, the promise of escaping, even for just one night, from the suffocating reality. The mansion was a relic of the past, a grand structure with marble staircases and crystal chandeliers. Guests arrived in groups, all masked, each costume more extravagant than the last. I, dressed as a harlequin, with a gold and black mask, entered the gates with a mix of anxiety and excitement. Inside, the atmosphere was pure decadence and luxury. The main hall where the party began was dominated by shades of red and gold. The walls, draped in velvet curtains, seemed to bleed in the candlelight. A large stage occupied the centre, where a samba school's drum corps played relentlessly, creating a hypnotic beat that mingled with the laughter and whispers of the guests. The masks, with their hollow stares, reflected the light, creating a sea of indistinct faces. Then, I noticed something peculiar. There were several interconnected rooms, each decorated in a predominant colour. The first room, where everyone danced, was the red room. Next to it was a blue room, where the lights were cold, and the shadows stretched along the walls. The floor was covered in a thick mist that coiled around the dancers' legs like serpents. The next room was green, with tropical plants hanging from the ceiling, the air thick with a sweet, cloying scent. The environment felt alive, as though nature itself was watching every move. There was also a yellow room, illuminated by crystal chandeliers that cast a golden glow on everything. There, guests laughed and toasted with champagne, their faces distorted by the blinding light. Further along, I found the white room, pure and silent, where laughter was muffled by translucent curtains, and the sound of drums seemed distant, as if from another world. Finally, I reached the last room, a black room. The darkness was almost total, except for a single beam of blue light that cut through the air like a blade. The walls were covered with broken mirrors, reflecting distorted images of the guests. The floor, deep black, seemed to absorb both light and life. As I explored the mansion, something began to change. A nervous murmur spread through the crowd. A new figure appeared, dressed in black, its mask a grotesque representation of a human face, with hollow eyes and an expression of agony. The figure moved slowly, and wherever it went, the sound diminished, laughter ceased, and looks of fear and disgust surfaced. I approached, curious, but as the figure advanced, something inside me began to scream for me to flee. A primal terror overtook me. The other guests, now paralyzed, seemed to feel the same. The figure moved toward the black room, and one by one, the lights in the other rooms began to go out. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. I was drawn to the black room as if an invisible force was pulling me. When the figure finally entered the room, the last beam of light disappeared, and the sound of music ceased entirely. All that remained was the sound of heavy breathing and the rustle of clothes as the figure passed through the crowd. Suddenly, the figure's mask fell, revealing what was underneath. It wasn't a human face. It was something indescribable, a face that seemed to melt, with exposed flesh and eyes that burned with feverish light. An unbearable heat filled the room, and I felt the fever of fire begin to consume my body. The terror was absolute. There was nowhere to run, no escape. The fever spread like fire among the guests, and within minutes, the room was filled with screams of agony. I saw people collapsing to the floor, convulsing, their masks melting along with their skin. I was among the last to fall. I felt my body burn, my vision fade, but before everything ended, I realized something even more terrifying. The masked figure was laughing, a deep, guttural laugh that echoed in my mind as everything went black. Now, from beyond, I watched Rio de Janeiro continue the party, oblivious to what happened that night. The fever of fire spread, consuming everything in its path. But no one speaks of the ball, of what really happened. Perhaps it's better that way. Perhaps it's better that no one knows that death came to the carnival that night and it wore a mask. But I know. I will always know. And from where I am, I still hear that laugh, reminding me that in the end we all wear masks, and sometimes they fall, revealing what lies beneath each of us.
My name was Javier Martinez, and if you're listening to this, it means I'm already dead. I was born and raised in Mexico City, a massive metropolis full of life, but also full of shadows. Everyone says that in this city, it's easy to get lost, either through the tempting lights or the empty promises of the streets. I always considered myself above that, a logical, grounded person. I didn't believe in ghost stories, legends, or curses. But about 2 months ago, my confidence was shaken in a way no one could imagine. I worked as a lawyer specializing in corporate contracts. I gained some fame among the businessmen along Avenida Paseo de la Reforma, known for being able to make any deal happen, no matter how complicated it was. But that talent led me to cross paths with something beyond our world. It was a late night at the La Merced market. I don't usually walk around those areas after dark, but I was searching for something specific, an ancient figurine an eccentric client had requested. When I arrived at the shop where it was supposedly located, I found the doors locked and the lights off. I was about to leave, frustrated, when a man, a beggar, appeared out of nowhere. He was dressed in filthy rags, his face weathered by time and suffering, but it was his eyes that froze me. There was something wrong with them, something deep and unsettling that made me hesitate, as if he knew something I didn't. "You're looking for more than just a simple figurine, aren't you?" he murmured, his voice raspy and barely audible. I ignored him, nervous, but he continued, his voice now a whisper heavy with meaning. "You need to know about La Malahora. It's an entity you can't ignore." When he mentioned La Malahora, a sense of unease washed over me. I had never heard of it before. The beggar explained that La Malahora is an urban legend that arose in the oldest and darkest areas of Mexico City. According to popular tradition, La Malahora is an evil spirit that appears to those nearing death. The legend says that this entity manifests in the early hours of the morning, especially in deserted and ruined areas, and its presence is always preceded by a heavy, oppressive atmosphere. It's said that La Malahora is not a simple ghost. It's a force of pure evil, a personification of fear and hopelessness. Those who cross its path feel an overwhelming sense of dread, and time seems to slow down around them. It's as if the very darkness around them becomes dense and suffocating, and when the presence finally reveals itself, there's no escape. It latches onto the victim's soul and drags them to a terrible fate. The beggar handed me an address, an old alley near the Plaza de Santo Domingo, and said that was where the oldest pacts were sealed. He claimed that if I was looking for something more powerful than a simple figurine, I should go there. That night I went. I don't know why. Perhaps to prove to myself that it was just another story, or maybe because something deeper, a darker curiosity, drove me there. The place was an old, crumbling building, its bricks stained by time and neglect. When I entered, the air grew heavier, as if the darkness itself was alive. The floor creaked with every step, and the silence was suffocating. Inside, I found an old man sitting behind a table with an ancient leather-bound book in front of him. "Are you ready for a real pact, Mr. Martinez?" he asked, without even lifting his head. I should have left right then. I should have walked away from it all. But I stayed. Something inside me, a force I couldn't control, kept me there. I nodded silently. He opened the book, and a stench of decay filled the air. "This pact is not like the others, Javier. La Malahora is not a common spirit. It comes to those willing to pay any price." I laughed again, thinking it was some macabre performance. But deep down, I knew there was no turning back. I signed the contract, sealing my fate. In the weeks that followed, my life seemed to change. My negotiations, which had already been good, became flawless. I made more money than I could spend, and my name echoed among the businessmen as a living miracle. But things quickly began to change. One night, coming home, I saw a strange figure. On the corner of my street, a tall silhouette, cloaked in darkness, watched me. It didn't move, just stood there still. I ignored it, thinking my imagination was playing tricks on me. But in the following nights, the same figure appeared, first distant, then on the opposite sidewalk, until one day I saw it standing at the entrance of my building. That's when I realized the nightmare had begun. From that moment on, sleep became impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard whispers. La Malahora is coming. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, certain I wasn't alone in the room. I felt an invisible presence, something watching me from the shadows, always at the edge of my vision. There was no rest. I knew something was hunting me. One night, I went to the Zocalo trying to distract myself, but even in the crowd, I saw it. In a window reflection, in the mirror of a car, always there, always watching. Chapultepec, where I used to run, became unbearable. The air there felt dead, as if all nature around me had stopped. I was being watched. Desperate, I returned to the La Merced market looking for the beggar. But he had vanished, as if he'd never existed. The building where I made the pact was in ruins, covered in dust, as if it had been abandoned for decades. And then tonight, it came. La Malahora is not just a legend. It's real, and I felt its presence invade my apartment tonight. I heard its steps, heavy and dragging, and the putrid smell of its approach filled the air. There was no more escape. Its cold hand touched my shoulder, and now, as I write this, I know it's behind me. The price for that pact was my soul. I laughed at the legends, for I was above them, but now I see they are real. And when it chooses you, there is no escape.
I lived in a small village on the outskirts of Oxford, England, surrounded by the cold winds sweeping off the Thames and the shadowy hills that twisted around the village, draped in thick, mysterious fog. On the surface, my routine seemed ordinary. Lectures at the university, where I taught the history of alchemy and ancient occult sciences. A comfortable, meticulous, and above all, disciplined life. Few knew that, in secret, I was devoted to the study and practice of magic. My area of interest, hermetic magic. Not the cheap tricks of illusionists, but the pursuit of ancient secrets preserved by the Renaissance Hermetics, hidden in books that weren't to be found in public libraries. I had access to rare texts, forgotten manuscripts with instructions on rituals, spells, and ancient formulas promising unspeakable feats. Yet my main motivation was the pursuit of expanded vision, a rare ability described in one of the medieval terms I had recently uncovered. According to the ancient scriptures, this spell would allow a man to see beyond human limitations, to uncover secrets veiled by darkness, and perceive truths that mortal eyes could never grasp. I imagined this would make me a sage, perhaps even a visionary, capable of understanding life and the universe beyond ordinary perception. One cold night, as the wind howled through the cracks in my window, I prepared the ritual with care. The instructions were clear. The spell had to be cast at midnight on a winter solstice when natural forces were at their peak. Each component, a mandrake flower, a raven's feather, and a piece of shattered mirror, held a precise place in the formula. In the background, I burned the necessary incense to open my inner eye, as the old hermetics called it. I focused, whispering the archaic words, and soon felt the world around me transform. It was as if my senses were dissolving, each atom pulsing with pure energy. Terrifying, but intoxicating, and I pressed on, even as an unsettling fear crept down my spine. At first, I saw only shadows. It felt as if my eyes were touched by a presence, a being, or perhaps a secret, something intangible beginning to writhe in my vision. I tried to maintain control, but soon realized the error. The magic didn't just open my sight, it opened a door for something else to look back. That's when it all unraveled. The environment around me shifted as if veiled, the furniture wavered, candlelight flickered with a life of its own, and the walls seemed to distort. For a moment, I thought it was merely an illusion, a trick of the overloaded mind, until the shadows took form. A pale, hunched woman draped in a heavy cloak emerged in front of my mirror, her eyes fixed on me, as if in judgment. I knew who she was, or rather, what she was. The same entity that many magicians encountered in their search for truths beyond understanding. In silence, she raised her thin arm, pointing to the right side of my study. Following her gesture, I saw, to my horror, a shadow floating beside me, a faceless figure with a presence so intense it felt like it was crushing me. Then the screams began. Not mine, but from unseen figures I knew were nearby. Every corner of the room echoed with ancient voices, each one pleading, condemning, accusing. The walls started to contort as though a dark, deep current pulsed inside, threatening to expand and consume me. I could move. The freezing fear invaded my mind, and my vision was flooded with images of figures in torment, condemned to an eternity that seemed to never end. I understood then that what I had opened was not merely a window to higher understanding. It was a gateway to secret agonies that were never meant to be revealed. My hope of achieving expanded vision had transformed into a terrible burden. The knowledge I had so eagerly sought began to flood my mind, but instead of wisdom, they were memories and dark secrets of other magicians, of sorcerers long gone, consumed by the same boundless ambition that now made me shiver. One last scream filled the room before I collapsed to the floor, finally torn away from the mirror. When I rose, my vision was dim, distorted, and I knew that something within me had been removed, torn away. I touched my face, desperately searching for whatever it was, but felt only cold, empty skin. The entity vanished, and silence returned. My house was just as before, cold, ancient, now stripped of any warmth. But something within me had changed. I could see things, shadows creeping in the corners, a presence that seemed to observe my every movement, my every thought. I was still alive, but I was no longer the same. The price of the expanded vision was my own spirit, and I realized I would never see the world in the same way again.
When I came here to Black Hollow Creek, I thought I'd finally find peace. You know, the kind of peace that only comes in an isolated house in the countryside, away from the city's hum and the weight of daily life. Just the sound of the wind through the trees and the rustling of leaves at night. At first, I found it beautiful, soothing even. But there's a curious thing about silence, something I discovered here. Over time, it begins to weigh on the ears, you know. At night, when all sounds fade, the mind is left alone with the shadows. And that's when my nightmares started blending with reality. On the first night, the dream seemed ordinary. I was standing by the creek that cuts through the woods behind the house. A thick mist rose over the water, hiding the reflection of the night sky. I could feel the cold, damp air clinging to my skin. Suddenly, a sound like laughter, but muffled strange, came from somewhere in the fog. I took a step back, and the ground felt like it was giving way. It was as if I were being swallowed. The cold became unbearable, the air thin. And then, before everything went dark, a voice whispered something I couldn't understand. I woke up drenched in cold sweat, the room plunged into absolute darkness, my heart racing. It was just a dream. Just a dream, I told myself. But that was how it began. The nights after that were worse. In one dream, I was in bed, exactly like that first night. Same position, same room, as if it were nothing but a repeated memory, nothing more. But this time, something was at the foot of the bed, a tall shadow, unmoving, leaning against the wall. I couldn't see a face or any details, but I felt a suffocating weight that seemed to swallow the air. I tried to move my hand, a finger, anything, but my body was frozen rigid, as if it were part of the bed. My legs, my arms, even my own breath refused to obey. I wanted to scream, but it was as if the scream stayed trapped, muffled, and the shadow seemed to draw closer. I woke with a start, my chest aching, as if I were surfacing from someplace deep and dark. The room was still dark, the weight on my chest remained. And then I realized I wasn't sure if I was actually awake. I forced myself to get up, turned on the light, and went to the bathroom. I splashed cold water on my face, but when I looked back, I saw that the bed was still made. I hadn't even gotten out of it. I was still trapped in that second awakening. And that night, I started questioning if any of these awakenings were real at all. In the third nightmare, I was in the forest, in a clearing I'd never been to before. The trees surrounded me, tall and still, and something seemed to be moving among them. I heard footsteps approaching, but I couldn't see anything beyond the fog that swallowed the ground. Then a hand emerged from a patch of mist, reaching out to me, and when I touched it, I felt something familiar. It was my own hand, and when I looked down, I saw that I was holding a pale, cold hand identical to mine. I pulled away, but I felt that icy grip holding me back. I woke up in the same clearing, only it wasn't a dream anymore. Or was it? Because the moonlight was there, the trees, the mist. Even the touch still felt real. I ran stumbling over roots until I reached the creek. When I looked at my reflection, it wasn't me looking back. It had my face, but the gaze. Something was distorted, like a cracked mirror. Can you imagine what it's like to see your own image watching you, waiting for you to fall into the trap of touching the reflection? Because I touched it. And at that very moment, I felt that cold hand on my wrist again, pulling, squeezing, almost breaking the bones, until I woke up in my room again. Only when I looked at the mirror in the corner, there was a red mark on my arm, exactly where it had grabbed me. I thought I was losing my mind. In the nights that followed, the line between sleep and wakefulness began to disappear completely. That same whispering voice from the first dream returned, only now it was clearer. It said something like, "You came back. You always come back." It didn't feel like a phrase anymore. It was a sentence. Every time I woke up, each time I came back to myself, it was as if I were returning to the same place. It was as if I'd never left. And then came the last night. I was in my bed, but there was this feeling, like something heavy pressing on my chest. I forced myself up and went to the mirror. And as I looked, I realized the reflection was smiling. Not just any smile, it was my smile, but distorted, out of place. I heard the same muffled laughter again, but this time it wasn't distant. It was the reflection. I tried to look away, but my body wouldn't respond. It stared back at me, and all at once, it reached out to the glass, then towards me. Only this time, the hand came out of the mirror and wrapped around my throat. And then I woke up, or thought I woke up. My breath still caught. I went to the mirror to see my own reflection. Only there was no one there. Just a dark void where my face should have been. Now, every time I look in the mirror, I feel I'm trapped between awakenings, as if each dream is a layer, an invisible wall keeping me from reality. I try to escape, force my eyes open, and all I see is my reflection, waiting on the other side, expressionless, watching. Every time I wake, the mist is there. I'm waiting, just waiting for the next awakening, hoping that this time I'll finally be free.
My name is Eric, and I've lived in the small town of Nordlingen, Germany for most of my life. Nestled within a vast crater, the town has always had a strange atmosphere, but I never paid much attention. Life here was quiet, peaceful even, until I stumbled upon that forum. It all started innocently enough one night.
I was scrolling through the usual posts when I saw a discussion about an abandoned tunnel just outside the city walls. They called it Tunnel 21, something forgotten since the time when the town had a secret military base during the war. A guy on the forum claimed he had footage of something unnatural inside. It was buried deep within the post, no catchy title, just a subtle mention. That's what hooked me. I followed the link, downloaded the file, and opened it. At first, it was just shaky, low-quality footage of the tunnel's interior, nothing out of the ordinary. Dark walls, ancient stone. But then something changed. Shadows began to writhe on the walls, moving in ways that made no sense. It wasn't just a camera illusion. I paused, rewound, and watched again. It was there, something moving in the darkness. Curiosity overtook me. The next day, I grabbed a flashlight, my old hiking boots, and headed to the tunnel. The entrance was easy to find, just as described. Hidden behind dense ivy, the stone structure looked untouched by time. There was no reason for anyone to have sealed it, yet there it was, and there I was. As soon as I stepped inside, the temperature dropped immediately. The walls were damp, and the air heavy. Each step echoed louder than it should. I tried to laugh it off, thinking, it's just an old tunnel, Eric. Nothing to worry about. But the deeper I went, the dimmer the flashlight seemed to get. The shadows clung to the edges denser, as if they were alive. Then, about 100 meters in, I noticed something on the wall. Graffiti. No, it wasn't graffiti. It was symbols. Ancient, angular, deeply etched into the stone. I ran my finger over one, cold to the touch, as if the stone had never warmed in the sun. My heart started to race. That's when I noticed the flashlight flickering, sputtering, and I hadn't brought extra batteries. I heard a sound, a faint scratching. My body froze, ears straining. It was coming from further down the tunnel. I should have turned back then, but I didn't. I needed to know. It was then I saw him, just beyond the reach of the light, a figure standing completely still. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I felt it watching me. "Who's there?" I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. No answer. I took another step closer, but when the beam of light finally hit the spot, there was nothing there. Just like that. But the scratching sound continued, now coming from behind me. I spun around. Nothing. Panic flooded me. I looked at my phone. No signal, of course. Nordlingen always had signal issues this deep underground. That's when I remembered the forum. I opened the thread, quickly typed a message. "I'm in Tunnel 21. Something's not right. I'm not alone." As soon as I hit send, the scratching grew louder, closer. I ran. I don't even remember when I dropped the flashlight, but suddenly I was in complete darkness. My feet were pounding on the cold stone floor as I bolted, and the sound behind me turned into heavy footsteps. I reached the entrance, practically throwing myself out of the tunnel, collapsing onto the grass outside. My heart was racing as I looked back. The tunnel was dark, silent, and empty. Or so it seemed. I got home that night, still trembling, but safe. I went to check the forum. My post had vanished. Not a trace. I scrolled through the topic, completely wiped. In the following days, I tried to forget, but something had changed. At night, I began to hear sounds. Not footsteps, but whispers. Soft voices, unintelligible, slithering through the cracks in the walls. I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, shadows that weren't cast by anything. My reflection in the mirror didn't always move with me. One night, after yet another sleepless night, I decided to confront it. I grabbed my phone, opened the front camera, and started recording. My eyes scanned the room, capturing every shadow, every movement. At first, nothing. But then, upon reviewing the footage, I saw it. Standing just behind me, a figure barely visible, cloaked in shadows. I turned around quickly. Nothing there. That's when I realized I never left the tunnel. Or maybe it never let me go. The shadows were here now, in my house, on my skin, in my mind. They moved when I didn't. They whispered things I couldn't understand, but I knew they were watching me. I tried to warn others on the forum, but my messages wouldn't go through. Every thread I created vanished within minutes, and no one responded to my pleas for help. I'm writing this now, hoping someone finds it before it's too late. The shadows are closer than ever.
You may think me a fool, I know. Perhaps you'll believe I've lost my mind, or that I'm a coward incapable of facing the shadows I've unleashed. But please, listen. Let me explain before you judge, for what I saw should not exist. My name is Etienne. I am a grave digger in Paris, working for the administration of the catacombs. I am not a man of many luxuries or ambitions. My life is simple. By day, I care for the bones resting beneath the city, stacked with near-artistic precision, forming corridors that seem endless. At night, I return to my small apartment in Montmartre, read a book by lamplight, and sip cheap wine before bed. Paris, in the late 19th century, was a city in full bloom. Its streets teemed with artists, poets, and philosophers debating grand ideas in cafes, while I went unnoticed, carrying my bucket of tools and my face perpetually dusted white with bone powder. I admit, I enjoyed this anonymity. It was as if I were part of the invisible framework of the city, the dark foundation of its luminous beauty. But something changed recently. We received orders to open a section of the catacombs that had been sealed off for decades. They said it was merely an expansion, a practical need to store more bones from overcrowded cemeteries. Yet rumors swirled among the older workers. They spoke of inexplicable sounds, of a silence that felt alive, pulsing like the heartbeat of a wounded animal. The corridor we opened was different. The walls were covered with symbols I didn't recognize, though they were undoubtedly human. Crude carvings, almost primitive, yet imbued with a disturbing intent. They resembled eyes, many eyes, all watching me, even in the dim light. When I first stepped in, a cold draft swept past me like a frosty whisper. My lantern flickered, but I pressed on, telling myself it was just air displaced by the newly opened passage. The task was straightforward: catalog the remains and ensure the area was structurally sound. But the further I went, the more I felt something was wrong. Have you ever been in a place where the silence feels heavy, as though the air is thick with unsaid words? That's exactly how it was. With each step, my heart pounded harder. But it wasn't just fear, it was as if something was approaching. Not physically, but spiritually, if you understand. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just another pile of bones, but I soon realized they had been deliberately arranged. Altar. In the center lay a skull unlike any I'd seen before, black as coal, its jaw stretched wide in a grin that seemed to mock me. A terrible vertigo overcame me, as if the ground had vanished beneath my feet. And then the whispers began. I cannot fully describe what I hear. Words I didn't know, spoken in a cadence that felt like the very melody of despair. The air grew thick, and my knees buckled. Suddenly, the shadows around me began to move. Not ordinary shadows, but indistinct figures, both human and monstrous. Their eyes glowed with an unbearable light, and I understood. And ask me how. That they were the forgotten ones, those sacrificed here, buried in secret to appease something. They didn't speak to me, but showed me. Visions of Paris consumed by black flames, its people wandering like lifeless puppets, guided by an unseen force. I wanted to scream, but my voice had been stolen. That's when I realized my mistake. I should never have entered. I should never have allowed the seal to be broken. My curiosity, my arrogance, all of it had unleashed something that should have remained buried. Summoning every ounce of strength, I ran. I didn't look back, though I could feel the shadows almost touching me, like claws trying to drag me back. When I finally reached the main entrance, my lantern went out completely, but it didn't matter. I was safe. Now here I am, speaking to you, warning you. I never returned to the catacombs, and I doubt anyone will ever seal that place again. Perhaps it's too late. The shadows still visit me in my dreams, and the whispers never cease. But perhaps you can listen to what I say. Perhaps you can understand what I've done. Or maybe you'll just think me mad. But please, if you ever find yourself beneath the streets of Paris, remember what I've told you, and never, ever break the ancient seals.
Chicago, the city that never sleeps, the city of wind, and the city that raised me, if you could even call it that. Tonight, its bright lights flicker through the window of this suffocating ballroom, the city's heartbeat echoing louder than my own. Tonight, I'm supposed to be celebrating. I'm supposed to be happy. It's my wedding night, after all. But standing here, my hand gripping the edge of a table, I can feel my world caving in. And she's right there, my mother, center of attention as always. She's talking to Maria now, my bride, her pale face tight with something I know all too well. My mother's smile is warm, almost tender, but I can see the poison behind it. I've seen that smile tear apart lives before. Mine, for one. I watch as Maria's eyes dart nervously. My heart thuds in my chest, a warning, a scream, but my voice is gone. I'm back in that house again. I was 7 when I learned what real fear felt like. My mother's face, perfectly composed, hovered over me as I sat at the kitchen table. I'd spilled milk, a simple accident. But for her, nothing was simple. "Look what you've done," she hissed, her voice low, so quiet it chilled me. Her fingers trailed across my cheek, deceptively soft. "You always ruin everything, don't you, Jacob?" I remember nodding, because disagreeing with her was like signing my own death sentence. I could see the fire behind her eyes, but there was nothing I could do. Apologies were never enough. She needed submission, complete obedience. That night, she locked me in the bathroom. For hours. It was dark, and I cried, but she never came. When she finally let me out, she said I deserved it. I believed her. "Jacob, are you even listening?" Maria's voice pulls me back, but I'm too late. Her eyes search mine, begging for an explanation, but I don't have one. "Your mother, she's..." "What did she say?" I ask, my voice a whisper. I can barely hear myself over the drumming in my ears. "She told me you're not ready for marriage. That you've always been unstable, prone to breakdowns." Her voice cracks, and I can feel the panic rising in my chest. Maria continued, "She said I should reconsider, but she's only looking out for me." The world tilts, my stomach dropping. I feel like I'm falling, spinning out of control. Not again. "Maria, she's manipulating you. You know that, right?" She shakes her head, looking more confused than ever. "I don't know what to think, Jacob. Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you warn me she'd be like this?" "Because I thought I could protect you from her. I thought I could keep her away. But that's what she does. She finds the cracks and slips inside, infecting everything she touches. When I was 10, I got a hamster for my birthday. His name was Billy, and I loved him more than anything. He was mine, a little piece of happiness in a world that felt cold and empty. My mother never cared for him, said pets were a waste of time and distraction. But I didn't care. Billy was my friend. One day, I came home from school and Billy was gone. His cage was empty, sitting on my desk like a monument to my loss. I searched everywhere, calling his name, crying, desperate. My mother sat in the living room, flipping through a magazine. "He must have gotten out," she said, not even looking up. Her voice was so casual. I searched the entire house, the backyard, everywhere I could think of. But deep down I knew. I knew she'd done something. I asked her, and she smiled at me, a smile that made my skin crawl. "Maybe you weren't taking good enough care of him," she said. That night, I heard a rustling in the trash outside. I never found Billy, but I knew. Maria is talking, but her words are distant, muffled. My eyes keep drifting to my mother, still holding court among the guests, as if she's the one being celebrated tonight. Of course she is. Every event, every moment has to be about her. And tonight, she's trying to ruin me, like she always has. "You should have told me," Maria says again, her voice shaking. "I don't know how to deal with this. I don't know if I can." I remember the time I won an art competition in high school. It was a stupid thing, just a local contest, but I was proud. For once, I had something that was mine, something I'd achieved on my own. I came home with a ribbon, showed it to her, expecting, hoping for just a sliver of pride. Instead, she laughed. A cold, hollow sound. "Art? That's what you've been wasting your time on. No wonder you're a failure." She took the ribbon from my hand, glanced at it, then tossed it onto the counter like it was trash. "This means nothing." I remember standing there frozen, watching as she walked away, leaving me to wonder why I'd even tried. I stopped drawing after that. What was the point? Maria's hand is slipping from mine, her eyes filled with tears. I want to hold on, to explain, to make her understand, but the words are stuck in my throat. I can't breathe, can't think. "I need some air," she whispers, turning away before I can stop her. And just like that, she's gone. I stand there frozen as she disappears into the crowd, my world unraveling one thread at a time. I feel a hand on my shoulder, too tight, too familiar. "Poor Maria," my mother's voice purrs in my ear. I warned her. I told her how difficult you can be. I turned to face her, my jaw clenched. "Why are you doing this?" Her smile is all teeth, cold and predatory. "Doing what? I'm only looking out for you, Jacob. You always needed someone to guide you." There's a flicker of something in her eyes, satisfaction, victory. She knows she's won. She always does. I'm outside now, the night air biting against my skin as I lean against the hotel's cold brick wall. I watch the cars pass by, the city alive and moving without me, while my life stands still. Maria's gone. She didn't even say goodbye. I can hear my mother's voice in my head, whispering the same old lies, the same old manipulations. "You're nothing without me. You need me. You'll never be free." I thought tonight would be different. I thought I'd escaped. But no matter how far I run, how hard I try, she's always there, pulling me back into the darkness. And I let her. Every time I let her. Because that's what she's taught me to do. I'm still staring out at the city, the weight of it all pressing down on me. Maybe one day I'll leave for good. Maybe one day I'll finally break free. But not tonight.
My dearest Anne, I write this letter with the last of my strength, with broken fingers and a shattered soul. This is not the farewell I wish to give you, but it seems Providence has chosen a different fate for us. In this damp cell, surrounded by rough walls and an unyielding darkness, I try to compose these lines so you may know what has happened to me. They took me, Anne, dragged me like an animal into the dungeons, where the air is as heavy as the sin they claim I bear. They call me heretic, child of the devil, without giving me the chance to defend myself. Here, the truth is a double-edged blade, both protecting me and cutting me down. I have heard the screams, Anne. We will have. The walls whisper each lament, echoing promises that can no longer be kept, the muffled cries of those who came here before me and never returned. One by one, they're taken for what they call purification. But purification here is something entirely different from what we imagined in our prayers. The guards visit me with cold, calculated instruments. I no longer feel my legs, crushed and twisted like dry branches in the wind. My bones, Anne, turn to dust by the zeal with which they insist on extracting a confession from me. It is a grotesque game they play, twisting my body until I am lost to myself. With each visit, they take away a piece of my humanity. They call themselves men of God, but I no longer know what that means. When they dragged me last time, I felt my skin burn against the stony ground, a heat that does not come from the body, but from the pain. They speak of redemption and grace, but their eyes are empty and, as if they no longer see what they have become. Yesterday, a voice beside my cell fell silent. It was an old man accused of witchcraft, and I used to hear him pray every night. His voice, Anne, his voice was swallowed by the silence, a silence here more cruel than any torture. For within it lies the fate of those who came before us. I know I am only a few steps from the same end, about to dissolve into this endless silence. I do not want you to see me like this, so I write this final farewell. If one day you hear whispers in the wind or feel a chill in the air, know it is all those who passed through these cells, waiting for someone to hear them. Every word I write is a goodbye, each letter a drop of hope I know I will never see again. Flee, my Anne. Go far from this land of injustices, where even smiles are as heavy as the pain we carry. Once I promised I would always be by your side, but you must understand the chains that bind me now are stronger than any bond I could break. Goodbye, my beloved. My body is still here, but my soul is already bidding farewell to everything I loved. When the last candle burns out, you will know that my sacrifice is complete. Signed, Father.
I've never been a man of uncontrolled emotions. I've always been meticulous, calculated. The kind of guy you see in a pristine suit on Bay Street in the heart of Toronto with a clean-shaven face and a Patek Philippe watch gleaming on his wrist. Successful. I've always been that way. But it's funny how life, no matter how perfect it seems, can hide rot. I work at the Canadian branch of one of the world's largest financial consulting firms. Numbers, strategies, projections. I've always excelled at that. Toronto is a city that rewards success. The tops of the financial district's towers seem to call to the most ambitious men, and I was one of them. I was. Until the day I met Daniel. Daniel was exactly like me but better. The kind of guy that irritates you just by being in the same room. Always smiling, charming, a commanding presence. He knew how to win people over. He joined the company a few months after I did, and somehow he managed to earn our superiors' trust in record time. Not only that, the clients loved him. He had this way of captivating anyone who crossed his path. And there was one thing about him that always annoyed me: his cologne. It was a distinctive, sophisticated scent. Notes of sandalwood mixed with bergamot, something slightly woody yet with a persistent citrus freshness like a soft breeze on a hot summer's day. Whenever Daniel entered a room, that cologne preceded him, wrapping around him like an invisible cloak of power. It wasn't overwhelming or sickly, it was subtle but unforgettable. He knew exactly what he was doing. That scent was almost hypnotic. At first, I thought it was just a curious quirk. He seemed different from any other man in the office, and that cologne was like his signature. But over time, I grew to hate it. Every time I smelled it, my stomach turned. It was as if he were marking his territory, asserting his superiority, and it ate away at me. It was at a cocktail party at the Fairmont Royal York that I realized just how much I hated Daniel. He was there, surrounded by important clients, laughing and charming them as always. And of course, that damn cologne filled the air, a constant reminder of his presence. I stood in the corner with a glass of whiskey watching, and right there, that night, something inside me snapped. Envy is a funny thing. It starts as a twinge of discomfort, and before you know it, it spreads through every part of you. I no longer saw Daniel as a colleague. He was a threat, a shadow. He had the life I deserved, the respect I had worked so hard to earn. So I decided that one way or another I would take his place. That night, after the cocktail party, I wandered over to St. Lawrence Market. I'm not sure why. I needed to think. The night was cold, the wind sharp as a blade, and the streets were empty. I walked aimlessly, passing the closed stalls, the echo of my footsteps trailing behind me. Then I saw him. Daniel. He was there in the same market, seemingly alone. He didn't see me. He was distracted, fiddling with his phone. And then, suddenly, I caught a whiff of that cologne. Even at a distance, the scent reached me. But this time, it wasn't comforting. It was oppressive, suffocating. The sandalwood smelled heavy, and the bergamot freshness had vanished, replaced by an impending sense of dread. Something inside me snapped. That night, Daniel didn't make it home. His body was found floating in Lake Ontario 2 days later. Accidental drowning, he said. He'd been out drinking, slipped on the wet shoreline, and fell. Nothing more. A tragedy. Toronto mourned him. The company grieved. But me? I felt good. I took Daniel's place as I had planned. I started getting noticed more, received more responsibilities. Everything was going as I wanted, until things started to change. The smell of Daniel, it never really left. It started slowly. A few weeks later in the office, I caught that familiar scent again. First, I thought it was just my imagination. Sensory hallucination brought on by memory. But it wasn't. It was there, in the air, persistent. And each day, the smell grew stronger. In the hallways, I'd smell the cologne before I even entered a meeting room. In the elevator, wherever I went, it was as if he were there, watching me, surrounding me. The sandalwood mixed with a bitterness that hadn't been there before. The citrusy freshness of the bergamot had vanished completely, and all that remained was a suffocating, heavy presence, like the air was infused with something invisible and malevolent. One night, I was leaving the office late when I smelled that cologne again, more intense than ever. It was as though Daniel was right behind me. I turned around. The hallway was empty. The only thing left was the scent, thick and inescapable, like a cloak of doom wrapping around me. Tried to avoid it. I started leaving early, working from home, but the scent followed me. At night, in my apartment at the One, Daniel's cologne seemed to seep through the walls, through the carpet, into my pillow. It was like he was there, beside me, smiling as he always did, and each night, the scent grew stronger, more oppressive. One night, I was jolted awake by a horrible feeling of suffocation. My eyes snapped open, and the room was dark, but Daniel's cologne filled every inch of space. It was so strong it made me nauseous. Jumped out of bed and ran to the bathroom. Standing in the doorway, the scent seemed to thicken, almost tangible, as if I could reach out and touch that invisible cloud. I turned on the shower, hoping the water would cleanse the torment, but nothing came out, only the cold, empty sound of the void, as if the scent had drained everything around me. Since then, Daniel visits me every night. He doesn't appear physically, but his cologne is always there, and I know it's him. That scent of sandalwood, once so alluring, is now a sentence. It surrounds me, traps me, and each time it appears, I feel like I'm closer to losing my mind entirely. Thought I had won. I thought Daniel was out of my way, but now I realize he never left. He's with me, and he always will be. There's nowhere I can run from his cologne, and maybe I deserve it. Because true victory isn't what you achieve, but what you can never leave behind. And Daniel, he's still here.
When you hear about haunted prisons, the name Alcatraz quickly comes to mind. That famous island prison in San Francisco Bay. What most don't know is that, beyond the notorious prisoners and escape attempts, something far more sinister lurks in the shadows of this place. For many, Alcatraz is merely a tourist attraction. For me, it was a nightmare from which I should never have approached. I arrived at the prison with a group of visitors. The people around me seemed carefree, snapping selfies and laughing. But there was something in the air that wouldn't let me be. The wind cut through the hallways like it was whispering secrets of the past, and a feeling of being watched weighed heavily on my shoulders. The daylight barely penetrated the thick fog, and the surroundings felt less like a historical relic and more like a living tomb. The story we were told involved a brutal riot in 1946. Prisoners treated like animals attempted to escape. The blood stained the floor, and the terror of that day was never fully forgotten. They say the echoes of that night still resonate in the corridors. As we moved on, the sense of claustrophobia intensified. The walls seemed to suck the air from around me, compressing my lungs. As we passed cell 14, a chill ran down my spine. There was something different about it, a coldness that hit me like a punch to the gut. I felt a muffled lament, but not from outside. It was as if it was coming from within me. Against my better judgment, I stopped and looked closer. I stepped away from the group without a second thought. Curiosity, or insanity, guided me. I entered the cell. The air was heavy, almost solid. On the wall, inscriptions left by former prisoners, like silent screams. What caught my attention was a mark, an imprint of a hand, but what disturbed me was its reddish hue, as if something much darker had happened there. It was as if the cell was alive, pulsating, waiting. I turned to exit, and at the end of the corridor, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A shadow, a human figure, but without defined features, floating at the corridor's end. My mouth went dry. I blinked several times, hoping it was just my mind playing tricks, but it was still there. Slowly, the shadow began to move toward me. "What the hell?" I muttered, forcing my legs to move and return to the group. But when I reached the dining hall, a strange emptiness took over the environment. What had once been loud and filled with tourists was now eerily quiet. It was then that I saw them. Sitting at the tables, silent phantoms. Men in uniform, forgotten prisoners of time, motionless, as if waiting for something. The air was thick with a metallic scent. But the most disturbing part was the silence, deep, almost suffocating. I stood there, paralyzed, until one of them lifted his head. His eyes, or what should have been eyes, were two dark, empty holes. My heart raced. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped. This couldn't be real. They shouldn't be here. But then, a hand rose, as if it wanted to reach for something, or someone. My instincts finally kicked in, and I bolted. The feeling that something was right behind me was overwhelming. My footsteps echoed through the halls, and terror engulfed me. I stumbled into a small archive room, locking myself inside. I needed to calm down, think. My chest heaved too quickly. That's when I saw the book. On the table, a dusty folder, titled, "Stories of Alcatraz, Those Who Never Left." With trembling hands, I opened the book. Pages and pages of old records, but something was wrong. The words began to distort in my vision, transforming into horrific images, flashbacks of the riot, the screams, the terror. I was witnessing, feeling every moment. The doors behind me began to creak, as if someone was trying to get in. The air around me vibrated, heavy with a suffocating presence. The silence was shattered by a terrible sound, a low laugh, but without humor. The room started to darken, and I felt the temperature plummet drastically. Something was with me there, something that no longer belonged to the world of the living. Suddenly, the words in the book changed. They were no longer stories of prisoners. They were names, names of visitors who never left the prison. And then I saw my own. The truth crashed over me like an avalanche. I was already trapped. Trapped in Alcatraz in a way that no one would ever understand. The shadows, the phantoms, they weren't ghosts of prisoners. They were like me, people who dared to come too close, to dig where they shouldn't. And now, I was part of this place. The door slowly creaked open behind me, but I knew what was coming. The shadows wouldn't let me leave. Not this time.
I was never one to believe in stories. I always thought that the local legends, the ones the people of Fernando de Noronha tell tourists, were just a way to grab attention. But that evening, when the sun was already setting on the horizon and the tide was rising, something changed. I can still smell the salty air, feel the warm sand under my feet, and the silence. That strange, heavy silence that swallowed everything around me. Have you ever felt something like that? The Brazilian island of Fernando de Noronha is a paradisiacal place. Everyone knows that. But what no one tells you is that when night falls, when the sound of the waves stops being relaxing and turns into something almost threatening, the island shows another side. They told me that some beaches, especially the more isolated ones, hold old stories, secrets that the elders avoid mentioning. And me, curious as I am, thought that exploring one of these beaches would just be another adventure. It was on one of those beaches at Bahia do Sancho, a deserted and isolated place where everything began. I had heard a legend, something about voices rising from the water at dusk. They say they're spirits, old fishermen who disappeared at sea. Just a legend, I thought. But that night, something very real happened. I was alone, sitting on the sand, admiring the sea. The sun was slowly setting, casting that orange glow everywhere, until the wind stopped. I don't know if you've ever noticed, but when the wind dies down on an island, the world seems to freeze. I felt suspended, even though my feet were still buried in the sand. That's when I heard it. A voice. No, not just any voice. It was soft, almost a whisper, coming from the water. Come. I thought it was my mind playing tricks. We hear what we want to hear, right? But for some reason, I stood up and started walking toward the sea. I don't know why I did that. My mind was screaming to stop, but my feet kept sinking into the sand, getting closer to the waves. I tried to rationalize it. It was just the sound of the wind, or maybe the water moving over the rocks. But the sound continued, and with each step, it became clearer. Come. With the water already up to my ankles, a chill ran down my spine. There was something in the water. It was impossible to see clearly, but between the movement of the waves, I swear there was a shadow. Too big to be a fish, too low to be a boat. It was a shape, a silhouette, dancing between the waves. Come. The voice whispered again, stronger this time. My body froze, but my mind was in chaos. What was I doing? Why had I come this far? That's when I turned, trying to run back to the shore. That's when I saw footprints. Footprints that weren't mine, because they started from where I was standing and led into the sea. But there was no one there. Every part of me screamed that this didn't make sense. I ran like never before, but the sound of the water, the sound of the waves wouldn't stop. When I finally reached the dry sand, I turned one last time. And then I saw something I'll never forget. The shadow was closer now, right by the water's edge, watching me. It looked like a person, but not completely. The body seemed to merge with the sea, as if it were part of it. And then it raised its hand, slowly and silently, pointing at me. I swallowed hard. My body wanted to collapse, but some force, made me take a step back, trying to retreat. It was in that moment that the shadow disappeared into the waves, leaving the sea calm, as if nothing had ever happened. I went back to the village that night, but I couldn't sleep. What was that? A ghost? A hallucination? I tried to talk to some locals the next day, but all I got were wary looks. No one wanted to talk about the beach. No one wanted to talk about the footprints. Now, when I tell this story, I realize sometimes when I'm alone and the sound of the waves surrounds me, I still hear that whisper, as if the sea is calling again. But I've never returned to that beach. Never again.